Welcome back to Oregon Public Retirement. I'm your host, Daniel Ryan, certified financial planner and IRS enrolled agent. Now, today, what we're going to be focusing on is what if I have the wrong hire date on my PERS statement, as well as what if my years of service are miscalculated. And this is going to be appropriate for anyone in Tier 1, Tier 2, or OPSERP. And it doesn't matter if you're general service, police, or fire, or any other pension system within the state of Oregon, within PERS systems. And we're going to unpack what to do with account reconciliation, data verification, and more. So here we go. There are very frequently times where you see your hire date and it does not match what you remember to be your actual hire date or start date with a PERS employer. When this happens, it's typically because you were hired in a position that was maybe temporary, maybe part-time. Maybe you were hired and they weren't sure if you were going to be in a qualifying position for a PERS member. Or you might have been hired by one PERS employer, and maybe that was early on in that calendar year, and yet you were then hired by another PERS employer halfway through the next part of the year, and neither one of them knew that you had been working together, and neither one of them knew that you had been there for more than 6 to 8 months, and the hire date was missed from the very first one, and it should have been counted. Whatever the circumstance is, this happens from time to time, and the goal is to fix this as soon as possible, but certainly before your retirement date. Because as you can imagine, when we are factoring in the issue of your years of service, this might mean that you have to work an extra school year or a whole nother calendar year because you weren't getting it calculated. Or it might mean that you're getting a lot less in pension benefits for no good reason because you did your time and you thought that everyone was reporting the information appropriately. Sometimes it just doesn't work that way. So it's up to you to take the onus and say, I am going to fix this, usually with a professional, but certainly coordinate with my employer and my PERS team and everyone else that needs to have the documents received so that we can fix the issue. Now, the first thing I want to point out is what we call a data verification process. That is literally where we fill out a form from PERS and we actually say, here's when I was supposed to have been hired, and here's what they are saying, and I need to make sure that this is correct. And then you send that into PERS and the investigation begins. Now, I've had it where the PERS people reach out to the employer and they have all of your archives in a cabinet in the basement somewhere, and they just maybe don't want to go through the process. And so they'll just spit back to PERS and say, you know what? Everything that we've told you is exactly the way it is. PERS is not going to come in with a subpoena and say, hey, we need all the documents in the basement. We're going to take a look through it. Okay, they're not going to do that unless you can show proof, like a pay stub, that shows that I worked enough hours, made enough money, and I was in a qualifying PERS position, and the employer screwed up in their reporting. Very rarely do people keep their pay stubs from 30 years ago, which is usually when you figure this out. So that's why it's critical that if you don't have your pay stubs, we have to first work with the employer themselves. And the reason is because if the employer says, no, we were right the whole time, and PERS says, hey, I guess they say that they're right, that can actually close the case and we will not be able to reopen that case. So it's very, very critical that you understand the steps in this process and know how to coordinate with the different people in HR and payroll and benefits teams so that you're not going to just close this case permanently, because PERS will basically wash their hands of it and say, we've already done this diligence before. We're not going to reopen this. So that's why it's so critical that we actually walk through this the appropriate way. The first thing that I recommend is actually that you start by working with HR and your payroll team. And you simply email them and show them any documentation or proof that you have, like a letter of your job acceptance or whatever it might have been. And it's very likely that that HR and payroll team are not the same people from 25 years ago. And so they really need to be made aware of whatever documentation that you have to take the stance that they got it wrong some 2 decades ago. You have to show that to them and simply ask the question, can you please look into this? What this will do is allow us to build that rapport and relationship with the HR and benefits team to make sure that they understand why we think that it's wrong, but also that we're willing to work together on this in a very cordial manner. They might say, you know what, you're right. Here's a screenshot. Here's the letter of acceptance for your job position. Here's whatever we have. And now what you have is the ammunition to begin the process with PERS. So they might have it. They were willing to work with you. They found it in the archives, and now we're ready to rock and roll. So what PERS is going to want to see at that point is they're going to want to see any documentation that you did get from your PERS employer. Now, if they don't want to play ball, then we have to start pushing a little bit more. And what I recommend as the next step is actually what's called the account reconciliation process with PERS. What that does is it shows PERS other documents like a social security statement that shows income and employer information from that time that you're discussing. And it can begin that process of basically inquiry and fact finding so that PERS can start asking questions without a formal verification process. If that doesn't work, then we go for the Hail Mary and we go for that data verification. They talk to the employer specifically, they get all the details that they possibly can, and then we see it resolved. I'm bringing it up more and more with people to say, hey, does this hire date look correct to you? If they say, well, actually, I was wondering, and they say, well, I was an RA in college, or I was a volunteer at my kid's school. Well, those types of jobs were not qualified positions probably. And so you probably don't have a case to go through the process. But sometimes, like I said, people will just be at the same employer the whole time and they just didn't do it correctly in the very beginning. I've also seen it where an employee basically went from one school district to another mid-year in their very first couple years, and they basically restarted their hire date and vesting time period and waiting time period, and the employer was reporting all of this incorrectly to PERS. And so you need to keep an eye out on this. I know that it seems like it should all be taken care of for you, and that would be my goal and wish as well. But unfortunately, it's up to the employer to tell PERS all this information. PERS doesn't know anything more than what the employer is telling them. So unless you bring it up to them, of course. But this is why we have to start through this process and actually start to unpack all the different implications that it could have for your retirement. And in most cases, I'm able to tell that client, we got your year of retirement up another year because of what we actually did here and accomplished. And we also found out that it's going to be way more of a pension because now you finally reached full retirement age or normal retirement age. And because of that, you have an extra year of service and so forth. So it can make a big difference if you don't know what you're actually looking for in your PERS statement. Make sure you check that hire date and confirm that it is correct. And until next time, happy planning.